Welcome to Counsel Culture, the Business of Law podcast brought to you by Byfield. Welcome back to Counsel Culture, the Business of Law podcast. This week I've got Liam with me. Hello, Liam.
Hello, Meg. How are you?
Yeah, I'm alright. How are you?
Not too bad, not too bad. Happier now that the sun has finally emerged.
Yeah, I don't trust it's going to be there.
No. It feels kind of cruel, doesn't it?
Yeah.
Like we see a little bit of it and then it disappears and whatnot.
Yeah. So let's just dig into the stories this week. Obviously, I think the headlines have been completely overcome with the elections in the last week. So let's just start there. A couple of interesting points. First of all, so the new government is the first of its kind to have so much diversity in terms of socio-economic backgrounds, and equally in the House of Commons, it has the most female MPs it's ever seen in its history. So pretty interesting statistics that have come out this week, and I think there's potentially a lot to learn from here for other industries, but including the legal industry. I think it's worth noting that, while kind of gender representation in law firms across the UK, and that's from SRA statistics, is kind of on par. When you go higher up the ladder, obviously, that decreases massively. So obviously there's a problem around opportunities, but I think also in terms of socioeconomic backgrounds, I think the SRA's stat on this is that lawyers from lower socioeconomic backgrounds, the figure for that, the proportion has been reduced from 21% in 2015 to 18% in 2023. So clearly this is quite, and I don't think that's news to anyone, but this is quite a classist industry. So yeah, I think there's a lot to learn from here. What are your thoughts?
Yeah, I mean, first of all, I don't think it's uniquely a legal industry problem, but it's a professional services problem, definitely, and it's a city in the problem more broadly than that.
Yeah.
I mean, it is interesting that the cabinet is the most socio-economically diverse as it ever has been. Parliament is more diverse, but at the same time, lawyers are massively overrepresented in Parliament, right? So there's a question there about that kind of overlap, and it does point the question back to law firms and other industries about, fundamentally whether they are doing enough in the socio-economic space. So it's not really a new debate, but I think it should put a bit of a spotlight back onto it.
Yeah.
I also think it's interesting that one of the first announcements from the new government is to talk about putting public speaking, communication skills into the curriculum, because I think that does get to part of the fundamental issue here, which is that the barriers to people from less privileged socioeconomic backgrounds start very early in the education system. And I do think there's an element of there being a limit to how much law firms can do as employers when they're looking at employing people who are, 24, 23, 24-year-olds and have already, the process unto which people find it hard to get to that point have already happened.
Yeah.
Meg, when you were successful in making it into PR Weeks 30 under 30, congrats again. One of the things you said in your interview was that I thought it was very interesting was about the PR industry has an issue around the fact that we talk about, PRs are recruited often for being the best communicators, obviously, that is what the profession is. But sometimes that's a byword for being the most polished, and being the most polished usually means having that kind of privately educated sort of thing going on, and that can be an issue. And I think similarly in the legal profession, a lot of the things, ultimately it's not just about how a candidate presents, it is also the fact that there is a bit of a
Like the schools they come from.
The schools they come from. Yeah. I mean, and this is whereas I think some of this is societal. The thing which I think is a legal industry problem is this fundamental conflict between obviously wanting to get the best candidates and the competition for having the top kind of Oxbridge candidates.
Yeah.
With a socio-economic agenda.
Yeah.
And I think that is a bit more of a fundamental conflict which hasn't quite been resolved in Big Law specifically.
I agree, and I think that's a very UK centric problem. In that I'm not saying that these issues around D&I don't exist anywhere else, they do. But I think in the UK the issues around the class system are so deeply embedded, it's not comparable to anywhere else. And I think it shows more evidently in the types of jobs that the opportunities that you have. But even within firms, who's going to get the opportunity to work on a big case or a big deal and that kind of stuff. And, quite often, and it might be unconscious bias, that will be chosen. People will choose certain people because of the client that they're, dealing with and that kind of stuff. And sometimes they feel that they need someone who might not have a northern accent or, do you know what I mean? So, I think there is a lot of that going on as well internally in organizations, and that's not just down to office, to be fair.
I think there are a lot of euphemisms, like they present well, they're polished, all these kind of things are sometimes, it's fair. Sometimes it can often just be a euphemism for, do they have a northern accent? I mean, I'm talking about this stuff now and you probably can't hear my northern accent. Yeah. And that's because I'm code switching, right? Which is a thing people from different backgrounds often do. Yeah. Which is when they're in a space where it's a professional space or whatever, they'll adapt to others and they won't necessarily be their authentic self. Yeah. I mean, there's an interesting theory I heard at university a long time ago now, called domination of public space or something like that. And the idea basically is that people from more privileged backgrounds feel confident in spaces because they feel a sense of ownership over it. Yeah. So in a situation where you're going to have to network with clients, all that kind of thing, people from less privileged backgrounds are just going to feel less comfortable. Yeah. And also people from more privileged backgrounds, through family connections, etc. I mean, ultimately, private practice is an entrepreneurial game, right? Yeah. At some point, you're going to have to be responsible for building your kind of your own practice. Yeah. People enter the industry with connections that might help them get there, but also once they're there, they will have family friends who are, at clients, etc. Sure. And we'll just find it much more easier to kind of adapt and thrive in that environment. Yeah, absolutely. And I think, just in terms even of the PR world, I mean, as you said, it's very much the same. I think in the journalism world as well, it's very much the same, which is interesting considering they don't get paid that much. But that's maybe why the people who go into it, if you don't need the... Yeah, I guess maybe. I mean, although to be fair, I think the poshest journalists actually do end up being presenters and earning the most. So it's an interesting kind of thing. But I do feel like a lot of, I mean, I'm not entirely sure what the Labour plan is to have that as part of the curriculum, and I don't think it's necessarily bad, but I'm like, instead of actually asking the majority of the country to adapt to the minorities' kind of expectations, maybe actually the conversation should be wired towards, making sure that everyone gets the confidence to speak publicly and whatnot, regardless of their background and without fear of judgment, and actually... I think to me that's true inclusion rather than assimilation. So I don't know. It'd be really keen to see the details of that. But yeah, I mean, there is also an interesting sort of overlap with the debate around NQ salaries, because we don't know if the new government will take a view on that. I mean, there are different views across the market on it. Personally, in lieu of a big sort of scandal, I don't think it will be a sort of bankers' bonuses type thing. No. I think it has broken into the mainstream press in a way which means there might be more scrutiny on it. Yeah. But there's an interesting angle where you could say, I mean, you could look at it and think, well, paying lots of junior people high salaries, it's a very productive part of the economy, legal services, it's justifiable, it's a growth market. These are all good reasons to not really mess around with it. or intervene in it. But, you know, who are the salaries going to? And there's no disrespect to anybody, but if it is also recruiting and the big salaries are going to a pool of people who are not representative of the general population, you know, if it's going to if the poshest kids are getting the most money, there might be a kind of injustice point there.
Yeah.
You know, whereas if it is a meritocracy, then maybe you could argue it's kind of fairer.
Yeah. Yeah, and I think, to be honest, within firms as well, I think depending on the practice area, the split between kind of the socioeconomic split is more pronounced. I feel like in the transactional practice areas, you tend to have a lot more diversity in that space in all regards, to be honest. Well, maybe not gender, but, you know, at least in socioeconomic backgrounds, you know, a lot of the private equity people are actually from up north and, you know, we're working class. So it's kind of interesting. I feel like in litigation, arbitration, and that side of things, you can't really pierce through that as well.
But then we back to where we started, right? As in those are the kind of practices which will put a much greater emphasis on the things which are taught in private schools. In terms of the debate club type, you know, culture.
Yeah, absolutely.
But I mean, I do think for there is an interesting inflection point for firms in terms of, you know, we have a more socioeconomically diverse leadership of the country.
Yeah.
Firms that do have more socioeconomically diverse leaderships maybe could talk about it more.
Yeah.
Because I think the idea is the logic which says that it's good to have that kind of diversity in political leadership applies to business leadership.
Yeah.
And, you know, you should be willing to talk about it. But I do think there's an element of, you can see firms are trying really hard on this stuff.
Yeah.
There is a kind of fundamental issue around that conflict we talked about in terms of still needing to get the best candidates. But I do think, you know, we need to cut particularly bigger firms a little bit of slack here in terms of there is only so much you can do when it's a societal problem.
Yeah.
You know, which it fundamentally is.
For sure. Moving on next, so still related to the election, obviously we've got the first kind of few bits of policy that might come through, one of which was obviously Rachel Reeves' speech this week, and clearly it was very much wired towards kind of planning, infrastructure, building, housing, and all that stuff. So, you know, the lawyer put out a story this week, which actually maps onto that, kind of putting out in a graph which firms have got the most planning lawyers in the UK. Topping that list is Pinsent Masons, and then B.B. Pittman's and Evershed Sutherland. Everyone in that list is pretty much quite a national firm with a few exceptions, but, you know, they're very much like UK firms. Again, I don't know how they've collected that data, so I'd be keen to see if that's actually fully accurate. But yeah, interesting set of data regardless. I do think we've seen across the market a lot more kind of lateral movement in the infrastructure space for a while, for the last like a year and a half or two. So clearly there's something brewing there. And that's across kind of, project finance and, you know, private equity and all that stuff. So you do have several practice areas in that, but it's interesting. Any thoughts on that?
Yeah, I mean, we know growth is going to be the big tagline, right, for the new government.
Yeah.
I mean, the first flagship speech was heavily focused on planning reforms. So a lot of the commentary around that, in terms of what I heard on, you know, the radio, etc., has been around that link between investment in infrastructure and economic growth.
Yeah.
Overall, I think the planning element, Labour have really got stuck into planning as the thing which is the first step, but it's probably not the only step as part of this. I mean, ultimately, the objective is just to encourage more investment. Yeah. And in terms of how that translates to the work that lawyers do, obviously there is planning is the obvious element of it, but obviously you would imagine there'd be lots of work for anyone who does the kind of financing or work with funds, etc., in terms of facilitating that investment. So, I mean, there's a lot to it. I think your observation is really interesting that the biggest firms in terms of doing the planning elements to it are traditionally national firms or transatlantic firms where it's the kind of legacy UK element. So I think BCLP were there, Warburg Dickinson, and Warburg Dickinson, I think, were on the list. Yeah. So firms which historically have a really strong set of credentials of doing the domestic planning work. The question for me, and I'd be interested in your thoughts on this, Meg, is the firms that, if this does happen and we start to see really significant investment in UK infrastructure, I would imagine a lot of that work will be done by firms that have relationships with those funds. So it'll be a lot of the US firms who do that.
I think so too, yeah.
But they won't do the planning elements necessarily.
Yeah.
Do you think there'll be moves by US firms to start to bring the planning elements or to kind of lateral planning partners? Or do you think they'll still want to refer that to kind of the national firms?
I mean, I don't know. I don't think the planning teams are the ones that actually bring in the big clients as much. Like, they're not going to bring a KKR, for example, over. So I can see why the US firms would prioritize anyone that's in that space of, PE, finance of those projects and whatnot. It makes a lot of sense to me from a financial point of view why they do it. I don't think it's impossible for them to at some point think to themselves, maybe you want to build on those, because I think the practices are quite nascent. So, you have to start somewhere, and it makes sense to start with bringing the money in and the clients in. But I think if you're a firm that's looking to actually build on that whole practice area, I think it would be a decent move to actually think to yourself, actually, maybe we need someone with that particular expertise. Again, I don't think these types of teams are as big. I don't think you would need like a team of, 10 partners. I don't, especially because I think the US firms are not mandated on these projects as much. And a lot of the projects they do are actually global rather than UK centric. So I do think a lot of these firms that are in the list here still have a strong share of the UK market for those projects. And I think taking that away from them will be a difficulty. But I think it's going to take some years, basically. That's what I'm trying to say. So I don't know. I don't think we're going to see that anytime soon, but it's an interesting thing. I think we'll see more movement in the planning teams between these firms in that list, if that makes sense. Because they've already got the credentials for a long time. They've got a set of clients they've advised for a really long time. So I don't know. I mean, I don't have a crystal ball and I could be completely wrong, but that's the sense I would get. Because to me, it feels like a lot of these US firms are trained to build by bringing big clients in rather than, building out an already established practice. So I don't know. That's my sense.
So the flip side of it is what we might actually see if there is a knock-on in terms of market activity. It could be more that the firms on this list towards the top look at beefing up and hiring more from smaller firms or... Yeah,
and also I think there's going to be a lot more promotions will be more focused on these types of, practice areas if they feel like, some of these firms that do a lot of real estate work anyway and a lot of infrastructure work and energy type of work and that kind of stuff. I think a lot of these firms, if they feel that there's an uptick, all of a sudden they'll be hiring more associates and, promoting more of them internally and that kind of stuff. I do think they'll be bringing partners that they feel are right for their particular practice. And I think you need, if you're a firm that mostly does energy infrastructure stuff, I think it's a very particular set of skills you need there. So no, it's interesting. Let's see if it pans out. My sense is, I think for the US firms right now is winning work that's UK centric. I think that's the key. And I think that's harder when the clients are so, in a way, institutionalized with particular firms. Really, really interesting. We'll see if that works out in the long run. But I think in the real estate side, there's a lot to if the plan is to build more homes and whatnot, and more student and senior living buildings and whatnot, I think that's the way in for a lot of these US firms, rather than trying to get a big ticket deal, on I don't know, like a massive, I'm going to say nonsense, but like a nuclear plant or something. It's things like that. I think that's much harder to get. So yeah, it's interesting.
And I think as well, people think about one of the other elements of the Labour plan is to reintroduce national house building targets, because obviously we have a significant supply problem. A lot of people just presume that means putting a house into a new build, like a Barratt style, new build. I always think of the Dursleys on Harry Potter type estate in the middle of nowhere or whatever.
Yeah.
That is part of it. But also what happens then, in terms of the roads that need to be built, schools and various other things, there's quite a lot of infrastructure around that. And one of the things Labour had in the manifesto they haven't talked about this time, but they haven't yet, is new towns, building new towns. So we're not just talking about, we're talking about work and projects which could be much bigger than the sorts of things we might have seen or expected before.
Yeah.
And the other thing is, it's not just about building new stuff, and it is also about conversions.
Yeah.
And I would expect some of the work around high value conversions, particularly in London.
Yeah.
And we're seeing a lot of that going on with Canary Wharf becoming more residential, etc.
Yeah.
That's all part of this,
Yeah.
And there's lots of high value work there as well.
Yeah, for sure. Moving on to the latest in the UK firm financials. So Linklaters and Allen & Overy pre-merger have released their financials this week. Obviously, I guess the only one left to do that in the Magic Circle is Clifford Chance, because Freshfields is not expected to report their financials this year. Slow May never does. So Linklaters had some positive results. It was really interesting. What was really interesting to me about the announcement from Linklaters was, and I thought that was a really nice touch actually, was the fact that they've had their managing partner, Paul Lewis, just, do a piece to camera with the kind of the headline figures and just the main practice areas that drove that growth, and put it out on social media. And I think that's quite nice. I don't know if they've done the same thing internally, but I thought it's interesting to see. Usually you only get the press release and it might make it onto the website for some firms, not all of them, but they usually just send it out to journalists. You get your story and it's fine, but that's that. And I just think it's nice to have a different approach, and kind of make it a bit more human. And to me, seeing a managing partner, sitting down even for like a minute and a half just to share that information publicly, I just think it's he's actually fully part of the business and he's involved, and he cares and he wants to showcase that to people, to clients, to the general public, so I just think it's really nice. I wonder if they've done that internally as well, but it was interesting. And those results, pre-merger results, were fine too. A slight increase in turnover, and there were a 17% increase in profits. So they were doing all right. I think it's they were in a good place, obviously, before the merger. So it's interesting. If anyone had suspected that things might have gone wrong for A&O financially, and that's why they would have merged, clearly that kind of, if anyone had that belief, and I don't think anyone did, to be fair, but at least that would debunk all of that kind of stuff. So yeah, super interesting. What fascinates me as well about Linklaters is that it's really clear that their US side of operations really helped in the last year, and they are really keen to push that in whatever shape or form. So really interesting stuff. Any thoughts so far on the reporting?
Yeah, I mean, just from a communications point of view, I agree with you that the Linklaters approach was really interesting.
Yeah.
And I'm not long enough in the tooth in terms of knocking around the industry to know sort of what it was like before law firms reported their financials, or presumably there was a time before it, because my perception, and if I've got this wrong, anyone can disagree with me, but my perception of it is that it's a sort of thing that's evolved.
Yeah.
And a lot of it being driven by the fact that we have such a
like
buoyant industry around the legal press, basically, in a way that other industries don't.
Yeah.
And it's become, it's become a thing. The interesting thing about the Linklaters move is it looked to me like the sort of thing a publicly listed company would do.
Mm-hmm.
Do you know what I mean?
Yeah.
As in, not just a thing you sort of, you bung out a press release, you do an interview with Bloomberg or Law.com or the lawyer or whoever. It felt like a kind of structured external announcement, which you would expect from a listed company. So I just thought that was really interesting as a kind of evolution, the next stage. But it's more interesting because of the fact that some firms are not interested in disclosing. There are still firms that don't want to. So there's a kind of huge gulf emerging. Everyone kind of doing the same thing. Yeah. And some people are saying, actually, no, this is a big opportunity to shout about our business and talk about how successful we are. And then on the other hand, there are firms who decided to no longer play the game. And when this was talked about this time last year, when I think it was last year, wasn't it, with the Freshfields announcement, the debate was, will other firms follow?
Yeah.
Particularly Magic Circle firms, and choose not to disclose their financials, and obviously that hasn't happened. If anything,
well, not yet, at least.
Not yet.
We'll see what happens with A&O Sherman next year, but obviously I don't even think the Magic Circle anymore. So it's interesting. What surprises me is the amount of US firms with a London operation, and part of it makes sense, that don't actually disclose their London figures in particular, because a lot of them I actually think are doing really well, and that goes kind of under the radar. And I think a lot of them is just the fact that the pool of profit is
technically can be quite complicated, kind of, in terms of the profit pools, etc.
Exactly.
Yeah.
So I think for a lot of these firms, it's kind of hard to actually measure exactly who brought in what work and what office it should be attributed to. So I get it. But I do think a lot of these firms, I wouldn't be surprised if in the next few years, at one point, some of these firms actually found a way to report their figures, because I think a lot of them are doing well. And we don't know, we only get the global figures, and we don't know the London specific ones. To be able to tell.
Yeah, because the story as well, in terms of what we do know, or what's reported anyway, was kind of already out there in terms of the estimates and the firms that are able to disclose that.
Yeah.
I think is that obviously, even into the kind of mid-market of US firms in London are the size of some of our top national firms in terms of revenue.
Yeah.
And, maybe do US firms need to shout about that? Maybe not. Maybe it's thinking about who are they competing with?
Yeah.
Maybe it isn't that important. And for a lot of these firms, even though it looks impressive to us, if a firm is turning over 200 million in London, for a lot of these firms, it's not a huge part of their overall.
Yeah, for sure. So I don't know, it's interesting. And I also think it's interesting that a lot of firms in the US are starting to rethink their approach to disclosing their global financials in the early part of the year. And, a lot of them, typically they just go to AmLaw and give an interview, and it's all very kind of controlled and all that stuff, and all the figures are there. And, AmLaw does a great job at kind of digging into the analysis for all the firms there, and, to their credit. But I think a lot of firms are now kind of considering other options in who they approach, the strategy around who they disclose that stuff to in the first instance. I think that's changing. I think it's interesting to see that the journalistic landscape in the US is starting to change. I feel like AmLaw is starting to get competition from Bloomberg Law, for example, or Reuters Legal. Maybe not in the same way, but Bloomberg Law definitely, I think, is taking a bit of that share. And I think it's great to have competition in journalism.
Well, I guess the difference is, so what distinguishes London from the US in this respect is that we have a highly competitive
legal trades,
which drives a lot of what PRs and a lot of decision making on how to communicate these things is driven externally by the competitiveness
Yeah.
of the legal trades and
Not
how
just who, but how you even put your announcement
Yeah.
together and what you choose to disclose. Yeah, absolutely.
100%. And I think, yeah, like you said, in the US, ALM has been and still is obviously the kind of top dog.
Yeah.
But it is interesting to see how. I don't think competition with Bloomberg or whatever is on the same level as things are here.
Nowhere near,
but it
yeah.
would be interesting to see how that starts to shape and if they start to have to,
Yeah.
approach things maybe slightly more like how people in London do.
Yeah, and I don't think it's an overnight type of shift,
No.
but I think it's going to take like years. But we're definitely seeing discussions changing around. Before nobody would be like. Partners at law firms in the US would be like, yeah, of course, our results are going to go straight to AmLaw. We're scheduling a call with these guys for that date, and that's that. Like nobody would even think twice about it. Whereas now, I think we're seeing a shift in mindsets and being like, well, actually, why don't we switch it up this year and see what those other people how they would approach it, and if we're happy with that approach. And I think plurality of journalistic publications is always great for so many reasons. I think it's really important to have that. Interesting. It's just from a PR perspective, it's just kind of more strategy is involved, I think, overall nowadays. And I think you just want to keep it kind of fresh and new. And Linklaters putting that video is such a simple thing to do, right? But it is efficient. And it's something new and people are like, oh, wow, okay, we'll definitely notice that, even though it's not that significant. People take notes. And I think it just makes you look a bit more transparent. Maybe falsely, I don't know, but it just does. Fascinating stuff. On that note, I think we're ending the podcast here today. Thank you all for joining us. We'll be back next week for another episode. You can listen to us on Spotify and Apple Podcasts. Liam, thank you for joining me.
Pleasure to be here.
And we'll be back next week for another episode.
You've been listening to Counsel Culture, the Business of Law podcast brought to you by Byfield. Thanks for listening. Don't forget to subscribe and join us again next week, where we'll be discussing some more of the biggest stories in the legal sector.